The bus hissed as it braked at the last stop, a lonely stretch of gravel road framed by endless fields. I stepped down with a duffel bag in hand, the heat of the late afternoon sun pressing heavy on my shoulders. Dust clung to my boots before I had even taken 3 steps. The only sign of life ahead was a wooden gate with the name Hollow Creek Ranch carved deep into the arch. I told myself this was just a job, seasonal work to clear my head, to get away from a life that had grown complicated and claustrophobic. Back in the city, there was someone waiting on the other end of my silence, someone who believed distance was only temporary. But as I stood in that open expanse of prairie, phone silent in my pocket, I wondered if distance wasn't exactly what I wanted. The ranch spread out like something from another time. Long barns painted red, but weathered to a rusted brown, corrals filled with restless horses, and the sharp scent of hay and leather on the wind. Men moved with purpose, their shirts streaked with sweat and dust. This was a world built on calloused hands and endurance. And then I saw him, Caleb. The foreman carried himself with an ease that set him apart from the rest. Broad-shouldered, sunburned at the edges, he walked with a sure stride, every movement deliberate. When he reached me, I noticed the quiet authority in his eyes, pale, steady, searching. His handshake was firm enough to test me, yet not cruel. "You must be Daniel," he said, voice low, the kind that carried without effort. I nodded, gripping my duffel tighter. "Yes, sir." He smirked at the formality. "You can drop the sir. Just Caleb." Already, I felt something stir. Not attraction exactly, at least not something I could admit to myself. More like gravity, a pull I couldn't shake, even in that first exchange. The first days blurred together in exhaustion. Caleb was everywhere, demonstrating how to tie a knot, correcting my clumsy grip on a lasso, steadying a horse I nearly let bolt free. He didn't waste words, but when he did speak, I listened harder than I should have. His approval became something I wanted, even craved, in ways I tried to rationalize as professional respect. At night, my body ached from labor I had never known. I lay in the narrow bunk provided to the hired hands, staring at the wood beams above me. That's when the voice in my head returned, Evan's voice. He had been mine for 3 years, my anchor in the storm. But lately, our calls had grown shorter, our words thinner. When I left for the ranch, he had kissed me at the station, but his eyes had carried something else. Doubt, maybe disappointment. I told myself this was only temporary, a way to earn money, a way to prove I could stand on my own. But beneath that, I knew I was also running from the silence that grew between us each night. Still, guilt lingered even in the smallest moments. When Caleb's hand brushed my shoulder while showing me how to handle a saddle strap, I felt my chest tighten. When his gaze lingered a second too long as I wiped sweat from my brow, I felt a heat I couldn't explain. Each time, I told myself I was imagining it, projecting what I shouldn't feel. One evening, after a long day fixing fences under the punishing sun, the men gathered around the mess hall table. Laughter filled the air, boots scraped against the floor, and the smell of stew hung heavy. Caleb sat across from me, his expression unreadable, his eyes occasionally lifting from his bowl to mine. For a moment, it was as though the room fell away, and only the two of us existed, his steady gaze and the quiet thrum in my chest. I looked down quickly, breaking the spell, spoon clattering louder than it should have. Later, alone in the bunkhouse, I replayed that look over and over. It wasn't just friendliness. It wasn't just respect. It was something more dangerous, something I had no right to welcome. Still, I couldn't stop wondering. Was Caleb seeing me the way I was starting to see him? The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore, and it lingered with me long after the ranch fell silent under the wide, star-soaked sky. The days stretched long beneath the August sun, yet each one carried me deeper into a rhythm I hadn't expected to find. Work began before dawn, and by midday sweat glued my shirt to my back. Still, it wasn't the exhaustion that filled my thoughts at night, it was Caleb. The more time we spent together, the more I realized his presence commanded every corner of the ranch. He wasn't loud or boastful, he didn't need to be. Men listened when he spoke, horses calmed when he touched their reins. And when his voice carried toward me, measured, low, tinged with something I couldn't name, it reached deeper than I wanted to admit. "Keep your wrist steady," he said one afternoon, standing behind me as I struggled with a length of rope. His hands covered mine briefly, adjusting my grip. The contact lasted only seconds, but in those seconds my pulse spiked, betraying me. I mumbled thanks, unwilling to meet his eyes. That night, I called Evan. The line crackled before his voice came through, distracted and distant. He asked how the work was going, but the conversation quickly stalled. Silence spread between us, broken only by the occasional sigh on his end. I wanted to tell him about the horses, about Caleb's unwavering patience, about the way the sky turned copper at dusk, but none of it came out. Instead, I said good night early, blaming exhaustion, though the truth was more complicated. By the following week, Caleb's presence had become both a comfort and a torment. We rode fence lines together, miles of land rolling out in every direction. Sometimes he talked about the ranch's history, about droughts and seasons that broke lesser men. Other times he said nothing at all, and the silence between us seemed heavier than words. One evening, a storm rolled in sudden and fierce, black clouds tearing across the horizon. Caleb and I ran to secure the barn doors, rain drenching us within minutes. Thunder cracked, horses stamped nervously, and in the chaos his hand closed around my arm to steady me. For a moment, we stood close enough that I could feel the heat of him even through soaked clothes. The smell of rain, sweat, and hay pressed in on all sides. My chest ached with the effort not to close the small space that separated us. When the worst had passed, he gave a short nod and turned back to the work as if nothing had happened. But I carried that closeness with me all night, staring at the ceiling of the bunkhouse, imagining the storm had never ended. Days later, while repairing a corral, Caleb surprised me by speaking of himself in a way he rarely did. He told me about a relationship that hadn't lasted, about nights spent alone in the foreman's cabin with nothing but the wind outside. His voice didn't waver, but there was a hollowness in it, a confession buried in casual words. I listened, drawn in by his vulnerability, by the realization that beneath all his confidence there lived a man as lonely as I was. It made me want to bridge the gap between us, to offer something I shouldn't. The first boundary broke not with a kiss, but with a touch. We sat on the steps outside the barn, the evening cool, after another day of blistering heat. Our hands rested side by side on the wood, not quite touching. Then, slowly, his fingers brushed mine. It was barely anything a whisper of contact, but it electrified me. My breath caught. I didn't pull away, though my conscience screamed that I should. I told myself it was nothing, that it meant nothing. But in my chest, I knew it was the beginning of something I couldn't control. That night, Evan sent a message, short, impersonal, a reminder of how far apart we had drifted. I stared at the screen, searching for warmth in his words, finding none. When I looked up, I saw Caleb across the mess hall, watching me with that same unreadable expression, eyes steady as though he could see the conflict inside me. I looked down quickly, but the question had already taken root. How much longer before I stopped resisting? Morning broke pale and sharp, the air still cool before the sun began its punishing climb. I woke earlier than the others, restless, my mind replaying the brush of Caleb's fingers against mine on the barn steps. It was such a small thing, and yet it filled every corner of me, louder than any storm. All day I avoided him. I worked on the fences with a determination that left my palms raw, keeping my distance, convincing myself that space would protect me. But distance on the ranch was a lie. No matter where I turned, Caleb was there, directing the men, tightening a rope, leaning against a post with that steady gaze that stripped me down to something I couldn't hide. By late afternoon, heat shimmered across the fields. Caleb called me to ride out with him to check a water line. I wanted to refuse, to claim exhaustion, but his tone carried expectation, and I found myself saddling a horse without argument. We rode side by side, the silence between us dense, heavy with everything left unsaid. When we reached the far edge of the property, the land fell quiet. The others were far behind, the ranch itself little more than a smudge on the horizon. Caleb dismounted and knelt by the line, but his hands stilled after a moment. He looked up at me, eyes pale against the shadow of his hat. "You've been avoiding me," he said simply. The words struck harder than I expected. I tried to laugh it off, to claim long hours and sore muscles, but the lie faltered before it formed. My throat tightened. I began, but I didn't know how to finish. I can't betray Evan? I can't keep pretending? Every answer was both true and false. Caleb stood, dusting his hands. For a long moment he studied me, his expression unreadable. Then he stepped closer, close enough that the warmth of him reached me, close enough that his presence felt like gravity itself. "You don't have to say it," he murmured. And I didn't. The choice was made the moment I didn't move away, the moment I let his hand lift to my face, rough palm grazing skin that burned at the contact. The kiss that followed was not gentle, it was charged, inevitable, like a dam giving way. Weeks of restraint, of denial, broke in an instant. I should have stopped him. I should have thought of Evan, of promises whispered in the dark years ago. But my body answered before conscience could, and I let myself fall into Caleb's arms. When it was over, silence returned, broken only by the restless snort of the horses nearby. I stood with my chest heaving, heart hammering, guilt already gnawing its way through the haze of desire. Caleb's eyes searched mine, not asking for regret, not offering apology, just presence. That night I couldn't sleep. The bunkhouse felt smaller, every creak of the wood reminding me of a line I had crossed. I turned over Evan's name in my mind, but instead of his face, I saw Caleb's, the way his expression had softened after the kiss, the way he hadn't asked for promises, only honesty. The days that followed carried a new weight. Caleb and I never spoke of what happened, but something lingered in every glance, every brush of shoulders when passing tools. The secrecy burned, both thrilling and suffocating. I caught myself seeking him out, needing those moments even as guilt sharpened with every stolen second. Evan called once more. His voice was distant, perfunctory, as if our connection had already thinned beyond repair. I told him I was fine, that the ranch was hard but good for me. The lie tasted bitter. When we hung up, I stared at my phone, knowing that whatever we had was slipping away, not because of distance alone, but because I had let it. On the final evening of that week, I stood outside the bunkhouse, the sky stretched wide in orange and violet hues. Caleb joined me without a word, standing close enough that our arms almost touched. Neither of us spoke. The silence said enough. I knew then that I had crossed a threshold I could never retreat from. I came to Hollow Creek to escape, to prove myself, to find clarity. Instead, I had found Caleb, and with him, a truth I was not ready to face. As the last light faded, one thought echoed louder than all the rest. I had found what I wanted, but at a cost I wasn't sure I was willing to pay. Morning came with a weight that clung heavier than the air. The ranch stirred to life, men shuffling from a bunkhouse, boots striking gravel, horses snorting in their stalls. I moved with them, but every step felt rehearsed, my body on autopilot while my mind replayed the night before in fragments I couldn't control. Caleb's hand firm at the back of my neck. His voice low and steady. My own surrender, swift and complete. The guilt came in waves. At breakfast, I avoided Caleb's eyes, though I felt them on me with every stolen glance. Across the table, bowls clattered and laughter rang, but between him and me lay a silence thick enough to choke on. I told myself it had been a mistake, a lapse born of loneliness and isolation. Yet when Caleb brushed past me later, his arm grazing mine, my pulse betrayed me. I wanted it again, even as the shame coiled tighter around my chest. Work that day blurred. We mended fences. Under a punishing sun, the men scattered along the line. Caleb worked close by, his shirt damp, his movements methodical. Each time I bent to hammer a post, I felt his presence like a shadow. We exchanged few words, but the air between us buzzed with memory, with the knowledge of what we had done. When the crew broke for water, Caleb lingered near me. His voice was casual, but his meaning was not. "You holding up?" he asked, eyes fixed on the horizon. I swallowed hard. "I'm fine." He glanced at me then, a look that held neither apology nor regret, only acknowledgement. It unsettled me more than anger would have. If I had expected him to dismiss it, to pretend it hadn't happened, I was wrong. For Caleb, it seemed what we'd shared was real. That night, I called Evan again. His tone was weary, distracted. He spoke of work deadlines, of dinners eaten alone. I listened, but the words felt foreign, as if coming from a stranger. I wanted to confess, to lay bare the truth that I had crossed a line, but fear sealed my mouth. Instead, I told him I missed him, the words tasting hollow even as I said them. He answered with a distracted hum, and the silence that followed was worse than any lie. After the call, I sat outside under the wide sprawl of stars. Caleb approached quietly, boots crunching the gravel. He stopped beside me, close but not too close. "You don't have to punish yourself," he said. The words stung. "You think it's that simple?" His jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Life's not simple out here. You want something, you take it. Otherwise, it passes you by." I turned away, unable to meet his gaze. His certainty was dangerous. It made my own convictions feel flimsy, my guilt less righteous. I hated how much I wanted to believe him. In the days that followed, secrecy became its own language. A hand lingering too long when passing tools. A nod across the barn that meant more than words. No one else noticed, or if they did, they said nothing. But every moment carved the divide inside me deeper. One evening, while leading horses back to the stables, Caleb caught my arm, pulling me into the shadow of the barn. His eyes searched mine, steady and unflinching. "You don't have to keep fighting it," he said. And though my conscience screamed, my silence betrayed me. We didn't speak further. We didn't need to. What had begun as a spark had grown into something consuming, something I no longer had the strength or the will to resist. That night, lying awake in the bunkhouse, I realized the truth I had been avoiding since the day I arrived at Hollow Creek. I had already chosen. Whether I admitted it aloud or not, the choice was made. The question that haunted me now was not if I would betray Evan again, but how far I was willing to let this go.